You stand from the chair. The gray arrives at the edges of your vision. Stars scatter across a field that is narrowing. Your hand finds the doorframe before your thinking catches up to what is happening. 5 seconds later, it passes. You say you stood up too fast and move on with the day. The speed you stood at has changed very little across your lifetime. What changed is how long the rescue takes. In the moment you stood, 500 to 700 milliliters of blood dropped from your chest into your legs through gravity in under 2 seconds. Your brain lost perfusion pressure. Your vision narrowed because the visual cortex, sitting at the top and back of the skull, is the farthest cortical region from the heart and the first to lose supply when pressure drops. And a compensation sequence involving a pressure sensor in your neck, a signal to your brainstem, and a complete recalibration of your heart rate, vascular tone, and venous return began racing to restore blood flow to a brain that has approximately 5 to 6 seconds of consciousness reserve at reduced perfusion. The dizziness was the delay between the drop and the response. Gravity pools the blood instantly. The Baroreflex Rescue takes 5 to 10 seconds to complete. After 50, the interval widens through 4 independent factors, each one adding time to a response that was already racing a reserve the brain cannot extend. When you stand, gravity redistributes your blood. Blood is a fluid with a density of approximately 1,060 kilograms per cubic meter. The vertical distance between your heart and your feet in a standing position is approximately 1.2 meters. The hydrostatic pressure difference this column creates, calculable through the product of density, gravitational acceleration, and height, is approximately 94 millimeters of mercury. 94 millimeters of mercury of pressure pushing blood downward through a venous system that has thin walls, high compliance, and the capacity to absorb large volumes without significant resistance. The arterial system, with its thick muscular walls, resists the gravitational redistribution. The venous system, with walls 1/10 the thickness of the arteries and a total capacity that holds approximately 70% of the blood volume at any given moment, absorbs the gravitational shift almost without resistance. The blood moves to where gravity takes it, and gravity takes it to the lowest point in the system, the veins of the legs and pelvis. The venous system acts as a reservoir precisely because its walls are thin and compliant, stretching to accommodate additional volume without generating significant back pressure. This compliance is what makes the venous system effective as a blood storage compartment during rest, holding 70% of the total blood volume at low pressure. It is also what makes the venous system vulnerable to gravitational redistribution. The walls offer almost no resistance to the fluid column gravity creates when you stand. The arterial system, with its thick muscular walls and high elastic recoil, resists the gravitational shift and maintains its pressure. The venous system absorbs it, and the 500 to 700 milliliters that pool in the legs are the volume the compliant venous walls accepted because they could not resist the hydrostatic column gravity imposed. Within 2 to 3 seconds of standing, 500 to 700 milliliters of blood have pooled in the veins of the legs and pelvis. The redistribution is gravitational, governed by the same physics that moves any fluid column in a gravitational field. Venous return to the heart drops because the blood that would have returned is now pooled below the heart. What happens to the heart when 500 milliliters suddenly disappears from the return flow? By the Frank-Starling mechanism, the heart automatically adjusts its output to the volume of blood returning to it. More blood returns, the ventricles stretch more, and the next contraction ejects more blood. Less blood returns, the ventricles stretch less, and the next contraction ejects less. When the pooled volume suddenly pools in the legs, the venous return to the heart drops, the ventricles fill less with each cycle, stroke volume drops, cardiac output drops, mean arterial pressure drops, and the perfusion pressure that drives blood up to the brain drops with it. The chain is mechanical and immediate. Less filling, less pumping, less pressure, less brain supply. The entire sequence from standing to reduced cerebral perfusion completes in 2 to 3 seconds, faster than any conscious awareness of what is happening. The gray out you experience is your brain informing you that perfusion has dropped below the threshold required for full visual processing. The visual cortex communicates the deficit before your conscious mind recognizes it, which is why the gray arrives before the thought "I am dizzy" forms. Your brain receives approximately 750 milliliters of blood per minute, roughly 15% of cardiac output. A 20 to 40% drop in cardiac output reduces cerebral blood flow proportionally. The visual cortex, posterior and elevated, loses supply first because it sits at the highest point in the arterial tree when you are standing. The gray out begins at the visual periphery and closes inward because the outermost cortical regions are the last to receive flow and the first to lose it when pressure drops. 5 to 6 seconds. That is the supply window at reduced perfusion. If blood flow to the brain drops below the threshold that sustains consciousness and remains below that threshold for longer than the reserve allows, you faint. The door frame grab is happening inside that window. Your hand reached for the frame because the compensation had not yet completed, and the brain was running on a supply that was draining faster than it was being restored. What detects the pressure drop? Embedded in the wall of the internal carotid artery, at the point where it branches from the common carotid approximately at the angle of the jaw, sits a cluster of nerve endings called the carotid sinus baroreceptor. The baroreceptor is a stretch-sensitive mechanoreceptor, a nerve ending that fires in proportion to the stretch of the arterial wall surrounding it. Higher blood pressure stretches the wall outward, increasing the receptor's firing rate in a continuous graded response that encodes the magnitude of the pressure change in the frequency of the signal. Lower blood pressure allows the wall to contract inward, decreasing the firing rate. The encoding is analog. The brainstem does not receive a binary alarm that says, "pressure dropped." It receives a continuously modulated firing rate from which it calculates how far the pressure dropped, how fast it dropped, and how urgently the rescue must respond. The brainstem reads the firing rate as a continuous blood pressure report, updated with every heartbeat. When you stood and arterial pressure dropped, the carotid sinus wall contracted slightly under the reduced pressure. The baroreceptor stretched less, its firing rate decreased. The afferent signal traveled through the glossopharyngeal nerve to the nucleus tractus solitarius in the medulla, the brainstem processing center that integrates every cardiovascular signal the body produces. Detection time, under 1 second. The sensor is fast, the rescue at triggers is slower. Mader and colleagues documented the age-related decline of this sensor in the Journal of the American Geriatric Society. After 50, the carotid artery wall stiffens progressively through collagen cross-linking that stiffens every connective tissue in the body, advanced glycation end products accumulating in the arterial wall, elastin fibers fragmenting under decades of pulsatile stress, calcium depositing in the media. A stiffer wall stretches less for an identical pressure change. The baroreceptor embedded in that stiffened wall produces a smaller change in firing rate from an identical pressure drop. The sensor fires later and with diminished resolution because the mechanical coupling between pressure change and nerve ending stretch has degraded. At 30, a 10 mm drop in arterial pressure produced a large stretch change in the elastic arterial wall, generating a strong decrease in firing rate that the brainstem interpreted as an urgent pressure alarm. At 70, the same 10 mm drop produces a smaller stretch change in the stiffened wall, generating a weaker decrease in firing rate that the brainstem interprets as a moderate pressure change rather than an emergency. The alarm is quieter, the urgency is lower, and the response that depends on the alarm starts later and with less initial force because the alarm arrived later and at lower amplitude. Monahan measured this decline in the Journal of Applied Physiology. Baroreflex sensitivity, quantified as the millisecond change in heart rate per millimeter of mercury change in blood pressure, decreases progressively with each decade after 50. Sensor detected the drop. The brainstem received the alarm. Now the fastest cardiovascular rescue the body performs must execute 4 simultaneous mechanisms before the brain's consciousness reserve runs out. Well, the brainstem launches the Baroreflex, a coordinated autonomic response that operates through 4 mechanisms simultaneously, each one racing to restore the perfusion the gravitational pooling removed. Heart rate increase. Sympathetic nerve fibers activate the pacemaker cells in the heart. The first heartbeat after detection is already faster. Within 2 to 3 beats, approximately 2 to 3 seconds, heart rate has increased 10 to 20 beats per minute. More beats per minute means more cardiac output per minute, more blood pumped toward the brain. Cardiac contractility increase. Sympathetic activation of the ventricular muscle makes each contraction more forceful, ejecting a larger stroke volume per beat. Combined with the rate increase, cardiac output rises through both channels simultaneously. Arterial vasoconstriction. Sympathetic activation of smooth muscle in the peripheral arteries narrows the vessels. Resistance to flow increases by the fourth power of the radius change, a relationship described by Poiseuille's law. A 10% reduction in arterial radius produces approximately a 46% increase in resistance, a relationship so steep that small changes in vessel diameter produce enormous changes in the pressure the system generates. The body uses this fourth power leverage as its primary tool for rapid blood pressure adjustment. A modest contraction of the vascular smooth muscle across thousands of small arteries simultaneously produces a pressure increase that can restore cerebral perfusion within seconds. The same cardiac output pushing through narrower vessels generates higher pressure. Mean arterial pressure climbs back toward the baseline the brain requires. Venous vasoconstriction. The capacitance vessels in the legs and abdomen constrict, squeezing the pooled volume back toward the heart. The venous system holds its 70% share of total blood volume at low pressure, and a modest increase in venous smooth muscle tone, even a small contraction of the venous walls, displaces a disproportionately large volume back into the central circulation because the system is operating on the flat portion of its compliance curve where small pressure changes move large volumes. Venous return increases. Cardiac preload restores. The Frank-Starling mechanism drives stroke volume back up as the ventricles fill more completely with each cycle. Simultaneously, the vagus nerve releases its tonic parasympathetic brake on the heart, removing the restraint that normally prevents the heart rate from climbing. The sympathetic acceleration reaches its full effect only when the parasympathetic brake is lifted. The vagus nerve normally holds the resting heart rate approximately 20 to 30 beats per minute below the intrinsic pacemaker rate, a continuous restraint that keeps the heart from racing during rest. When the Baroreflex detects the pressure drop, one of its first actions is to withdraw this vagal brake, allowing the heart rate to climb toward its intrinsic rate before the sympathetic acceleration pushes it further. The vagal withdrawal is the fastest component of the entire rescue, operating within 1 to 2 heartbeats, because parasympathetic withdrawal requires only the cessation of a signal rather than the initiation of one. Total response time, 5 to 10 seconds from detection to restored cerebral perfusion. Heart rate up, vessels constricted, blood return, pressure restored. The gray out clears, the stars fade, and you release the door frame. Now every door frame grab I have experienced since learning the Baroreflex carries the countdown in it. The hand that reached for the frame was reaching inside a 5-second window while 4 mechanisms raced to close the gap before the perfusion buffer expired. The dizziness was the race in progress. The clearing was the race won. Every time you have stood up for 6 decades. The question is why it almost fails now, why the gray out that never happened at 30 happens 3 times a week at 70. The response mechanisms have not changed. 4 components of the rescue have each independently slowed, and the countdown the rescue is racing against has not gotten any longer. Why does the gap widen after 50? 4 independent factors, each one adding delay or reducing the rescue's effectiveness. Each factor operates through a different physical mechanism. Together they compound against a countdown that remains fixed at the consciousness reserve. Now, Factor 1. Baroreceptor sensitivity declines. The stiffened arterial wall produces a smaller stretch signal from an identical pressure change. Monahan measured this decline in the Journal of Applied Physiology. Baroreflex sensitivity, measured as the change in heart rate per unit change in blood pressure, decreases progressively with age. The sensor detects the same drop but reports it with less urgency. The brainstem receives the alarm later and at lower amplitude, and the correction starts with a delay measured in hundreds of milliseconds, significant when the total countdown is the consciousness reserve. Factor 2. Autonomic conduction velocity slows. The sympathetic neurons that carry the rescue commands from brainstem to heart and blood vessels are myelinated fibers whose insulation thins at 1 to 2% per year with age. Each signal in the Baroreflex arc arrives fractionally later at its target organ. The heart rate command that reached the pacemaker in 400 milliseconds at 30 requires 550 milliseconds at 70. The vasoconstriction command that reached the peripheral vessels in 300 milliseconds requires 420 milliseconds. Each delay is individually small, measured in tens of milliseconds per relay. But the Baroreflex arc passes through multiple relays, brainstem to spinal cord to sympathetic ganglion, ganglion to target organ. Each relay adds the delay across 4 simultaneous pathways, each passing through multiple relays. The cumulative delay at 70 is measured in hundreds of milliseconds longer than at 30. In a system racing a 5 to 6 second reserve window, hundreds of milliseconds represent a significant fraction of the available time. Factor 3. Maximum heart rate response is blunted. Maximum heart rate declines approximately 1 beat per year, the basis of the 220-age estimation. The pacemaker cells at 70 cannot accelerate as rapidly or climb as high as at 30. The rescue asks the heart to speed up, and the heart speeds up less. The cardiac output increase that should compensate for the pooling delivers less compensation per second. At 30, the heart could accelerate from 70 to 110 beats per minute within 3 seconds of the Baroreflex command, a 57% increase in rate that translated directly into 57% more cardiac output per minute. At 70, the same Baroreflex command accelerates the heart from 70 to perhaps 90 beats per minute, a 29% increase, roughly half the compensatory capacity the same rescue delivered 4 decades earlier. And then factor 4, blood volume may already be reduced before you stand. Chronic mild dehydration from the reduced thirst sensation that accompanies aging. The hypothalamic osmoreceptors that trigger thirst become less sensitive after 50, requiring a higher serum osmolality to generate the same thirst signal. You are more dehydrated before you feel thirsty than you were at 30, and the circulating volume that determines your pressure reserve reflects that deficit every time you stand. Sodium restriction from the decades of dietary advice the SALT discussion described. Diuretic medications that increase renal water and sodium excretion, each one reduces the circulating blood volume the rescue has to work with. Less starting volume means less pressure reserve, means a deeper initial drop from an identical positional change, means the reserve window begins from a worse starting position. The rescue has less to work with before it begins. I traced my own dizziness across the 4 factors the week I learned the compound arithmetic. The sensor firing later because the arterial wall stiffened, the commands arriving later because the insulation thinned, the heart accelerating less because the maximum rate dropped, the volume already reduced because the thirst signal weakened. 4 delays accumulating against a countdown that stayed the same length it was at 30. The 5-second rescue at 30 becomes a 7 to 8 second response at 70, inside a reserve window that is still the consciousness reserve. The rescue at 30 completed with 2 to 3 seconds of margin. The rescue at 70 arrives 1 to 2 seconds after the margin ran out. The gray out at 70 is the 1 to 2 seconds of consciousness, reserve deficit that the widened gap created, the interval between when the brain needed the perfusion restored and when the slower rescue delivered it. 4 factors widened the gap, but for millions of people over 65, the interval was widened further. By the medications prescribed for the cardiovascular conditions the Baroreflex was designed to manage. What happens when the rescue is pharmacologically suppressed? 3 drug classes, each suppressing a different response component. Beta blockers, prescribed for hypertension and heart rate control, block the receptors on the pacemaker cells that receive the sympathetic command to accelerate. The heart receives the Baroreflex command to accelerate and cannot comply. The command arrives as norepinephrine released from sympathetic nerve endings onto the beta-1 adrenergic receptors on the pacemaker cells. In a heart without beta blocker, norepinephrine binds the receptor, activates the intracellular signaling cascade, and the pacemaker cells accelerate within 1 heartbeat. In a heart on metoprolol or atenolol, the drug molecules occupy the beta-1 receptors, physically blocking norepinephrine from binding. The sympathetic nerve releases the neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitter finds the receptor occupied. The acceleration command cannot execute. The first rescue mechanism, heart rate increase, is pharmacologically disabled. The heart continues beating at its pre-standing rate while the brain is losing supply, and the cardiac output that should have increased through rate acceleration stays flat during the seconds the reserve window is running. Alpha blockers, prescribed for prostate symptoms or hypertension, block the receptors on vascular smooth muscle that receive the sympathetic command to constrict. The vessels cannot narrow in response to the Baroreflex command because the alpha-1 receptors on the vascular smooth muscle cells are occupied by the drug. The sympathetic nerve releases norepinephrine. The norepinephrine reaches the vessel wall, and the receptors that would trigger the calcium release cascade that contracts the smooth muscle are blocked. The vessel receives the constriction command and cannot execute it. The third rescue mechanism, arterial vasoconstriction, the mechanism that leverages the fourth power relationship to generate rapid pressure recovery, is pharmacologically disabled. The enormous pressure leverage the body normally uses as its primary rapid response tool is removed from the rescue. Thiazide diuretics, the medication described depleting both substrates of the sodium-potassium pump, reduce blood volume by increasing renal sodium and water excretion. The fourth factor, starting blood volume, is pharmacologically reduced before you stand. The thiazide increases sodium excretion at the kidney. Water follows the sodium osmotically, and the total circulating volume shrinks by the amount the kidneys excreted that the dietary intake did not replace. The blood volume the salt discussion described the body defending through the aldosterone cascade is the volume the thiazide is specifically designed to reduce, because reducing blood volume is how the drug lowers blood pressure. The therapeutic mechanism and the orthostatic vulnerability are the same physics. Less volume means less pressure, which is the therapeutic goal for hypertension and the risk factor for the pressure drop when you stand. Ricci and colleagues confirmed the prevalence in the Journal of the American Heart Association. Orthostatic hypotension affects 20 to 30% of adults over 65. Bao and colleagues established in Hypertension that medication-induced orthostatic hypotension is a recognized clinical entity that physicians actively manage when it is reported. Whether any of these medications should be adjusted, retimed, or reconsidered is a clinical decision between you and your physician. This sequence teaches the physics of what each medication does to the Baroreflex Rescue. Your physician manages the prescription. If you experience worsening dizziness on standing, reporting the symptom is the step that initiates the clinical conversation. Is there a mechanical assist that runs alongside the neural one? There is. The mechanical assist operates alongside it. Calf muscles, the soleus and gastrocnemius. The walking discussion described these muscles returning venous blood from the legs during every step. The same pump operates when you stand. Calf contraction compresses the deep veins of the lower leg, generating pressure that pushes the pooled blood upward. One-way valves spaced along the deep veins prevent the blood from falling back down when the muscle relaxes. The valve leaflets close under the weight of the blood above them, holding each increment of upward progress. The next contraction pushes the blood past the next valve, which closes behind it. Each contraction relaxation cycle moves a bolus of blood one valve segment closer to the heart. The pump is mechanical, requires no neural input, and operates on the same principle as a hand-operated bilge pump. Squeeze, push upward, valve closes, release, repeat. You who stand and immediately take a step or contract the calves activate the mechanical pump that reduces the depth of the pressure drop the neural response must compensate for. You who stand motionless from a deep chair rely entirely on the neural compensation without the mechanical assist. Toe raises, calf contractions, or simply stepping forward recruits the pump the Baroreflex does not have to compensate for. The practical physics, before standing from a low chair, contract the calf muscles 2 or 3 times while still seated, priming the pump and beginning venous return before gravity has a chance to pool the full volume. Stand and take a step within the first second. The step activates the pump at the moment the gravitational pooling is at its deepest, providing mechanical assistance during the seconds the neural response is still ramping up. The two systems, neural and mechanical, operating simultaneously, close the interval faster than either system could close it alone, and then when the correction arrives too late, the reserve window expires. Syncope. Loss of consciousness. A fall from standing height onto a surface the body was not prepared to meet. Falls are the #1 cause of injury death in adults over 65. Haingens and colleagues reported in the Annals of Internal Medicine that a hip fracture from a fall in this demographic carries a 20 to 30% one-year mortality. The mortality comes from the immobility cascade that follows the fracture, deep vein thrombosis forming in the legs, through the 3 factors Virchow identified as the triad of clot formation, stasis of blood flow because the calf muscle pump is inactive during bed rest, and the blood pools without the mechanical compression that would keep it moving. Endothelial injury from the surgical repair of the fracture or from the pressure of prolonged immobility against the vessel walls, and hypercoagulability from the inflammatory response the fracture and surgery trigger. All 3 factors converge during the weeks of bed rest that follow a hip fracture, and the clot that forms in the deep veins of the immobilized leg can embolize to the lungs. Hospital-acquired pneumonia developing from reduced respiratory function, when the pain of the fracture prevents the deep breathing and coughing that clear the lungs. Rapid muscle atrophy progressing at 3 to 5% per week of bed rest, accelerating the sarcopenia that was already advancing before the fall. Loss of functional independence from the combined effect of muscle loss, deconditioning, and the fear of falling again that restricts subsequent mobility. The fracture is the event, the cascade is the consequence, and the cascade began with a 5-second gap between gravity and a rescue that arrived too late. Dizziness and a hip fracture are separated by the distance the response covers or fails to cover, and the numbers Hypotensions reported changed how I understand every time I stand from a low chair. Well, the 5-second doorframe grab sits at the boundary between a moment of dizziness and an event that can alter the trajectory of every remaining year. The gap between the drop and the rescue is the interval between stability and a fall. The width of that gap widens with each decade through the 4 factors the aging process compounds against a reserve the brain cannot extend. Gravity has always been instant. The rescue has always been delayed. The speed you stood at mattered less than the speed your body responded. The interval widened through 4 independent delays compounding against a window the brain has no override for. The dizziness is the body buying time, while the compensation arrives. Every gray out is the same race running inside the same window. Every clearing is the same 4 mechanisms arriving in time. Every decade adds delay to the response while the window stays the same length. The door frame was about 5 seconds of blood supply the brain could not afford to lose.